everyone, and welcome to this Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Leanne, and this is my first time hosting, so I'm very excited to be here with you all today. Thank you to all of the teachers and students who are joining via live stream and YouTube. This month, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants is celebrating women in science and exploration. And from February 12th to 14th, we are hosting the Women Blaze Trails event. This is an event where women from all around the world are going to be sharing their amazing work and scientific discoveries. For more information, you can look at this link here, www.womenblazetrails.com, to get more insight on what is going on for this event. Now, to kick off this month full of exciting women in science and exploration, I would like to introduce our guest for today, Kasia. Kasia is going to tell us all about her scientific discoveries with animals including pythons, lizards, and many more across the world. Kasia, thank you for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Leanne, for having me.
Of course.
All right, so I'll get started then with my presentation right away. I don't know if we can bring it from behind the scenes. I'm ready to get going. There it is. So you're probably aware my talk is from blizzards to lizards. I'm so excited to see that there's a school here from Winnipeg. I don't know if there's any other prairie people out there, but I'm originally from Saskatchewan. And this talk is a little bit about my research, specifically what I did when I was in Borneo, but it's also sort of talking about what it's like being someone from, for example, the Canadian prairies, where you wouldn't imagine necessarily that you could sort of start a career in tropical ecology and what that looks like, if that's something that you're interested in getting into, kind of moving forward in that direction. So without further ado, I'll start off by telling you a little bit about my background, which is pretty broad, because honestly, biology is a huge field of study, and I am fascinated by just about every aspect of it. If I had to be specific about where my sort of speciality is, I would say that I'm an environmental biologist and conservationist with a focus on entomology, which is the study of insects, and herpetology, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians. Now, my most recent job and my most recent research centered around herpetology. And specifically, the research I'm going to be talking to you about today has a very catchy title: Prey Associated with the Asian Water Monitor Lizard and the Lower Kinabatangan Wildlife Sanctuary in Malaysian Borneo. Rolls right off the tongue, I know. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. But first thing, if I could just invite you to step into my office would look something like this. Just standing out in the environment and trying to gather meaningful data about a species or the environment of a particular species. That's what I do. So while I'm originally from Saskatoon and I studied my undergraduate degree at the University of Saskatchewan, which is a wonderful university, the last 5 years I've been focusing my work on the tropical regions of the world. And basically I went from this life, which some of you might be familiar with out there, to this life, a complete turnaround, working with some of the most incredible researchers I've ever met. That's us getting ready to sample a reticulated python for a python project. Now, this complete turnaround wasn't easy. And before I talk more about my research, I want to tell you a little secret about working in biology, which is if you're interested in this kind of science, it's worth noting that you don't have to have a linear career path. You can take some twists and turns, and in fact, that might help you build your career in biology. So there was not, as you can maybe imagine, maybe it's different now even actually, but when I was an undergraduate in Saskatchewan, there wasn't a lot of opportunities to study tropical ecology. It's a great place if you are interested in studying agriculture or the Arctic. A lot of wonderful research going on about kind of that area of biology, but I found it really difficult to find people who were interested or could give me experience with tropical ecology, and in particular, herpetology was really, really tricky. So my first step for my career actually landed me in Vancouver Aquarium. So my background also includes experience in exotic animal husbandry and working with animals in this kind of setting and researching them for conservation purposes. And that was a really wonderful experience, something completely new and different for me, and the first sort of tropical experience that I had. But even by the time that I moved to Vancouver and started my job working with all of the different kinds of animals there, I already knew that my passion and my goal was to do research or some kind of field work in Borneo. Where's Borneo? You might not have heard of this incredible island. It's just off the coast of Singapore. I don't know if you can, I think you can see my cursor there. So Singapore is over here, China is up here in the north, there's the Philippines, of course. This whole island here is Borneo, and it's very unique culturally because it has 3 different countries on it. There's Brunei, kind of a small country sandwiched up here in Malaysia in the north. There's Malaysia kind of through the middle and in the northern part, and then Indonesia begins here in the south. And you can see Indonesia expands here further to all these islands as well. So culturally very diverse, and also biologically extremely diverse. It's a treasure trove of biodiversity with wild pygmy elephants, crocodiles, monkeys, giant reticulated pythons, colorful insects, birds. You can see a little baby orangutan in that video. And unfortunately, this incredible world is also rapidly disappearing as agriculture and mining start to kind of expand across the island. Biologists working out there currently are rushing to catch up with this agriculture and mining world and work together with the local industry to try to inform how best to undertake these practices in a way that would minimize the impacts on the local wildlife. It's one of those places with a huge amount of biodiversity that's also at the forefront of emerging conservation practices. And I was determined to get there. I found a research program I wanted to get into. It was based out of Cardiff University, which is in Wales in the UK. It included a research component within the Danau Girang Field Center in Malaysian Borneo. This is a research center affiliated with the university, and it's known for being the first in the world to radio collar and track pythons and provide valuable data as well on local pangolin populations. And they're also doing pivotal research about the local pygmy elephant population, as well as a host of other really exciting research. And I found a supervisor who was willing to take me on as a student there. He's also the director of that field school. His name is Professor Benoit Goossens, and his entire career is incredible. He seems to have worked with every single large endangered species on our planet. So I was determined. This is what I wanted to do. However, this program was super competitive. Going from Saskatchewan and trying to end up in a place like this, in a field center like this, was going to be difficult for me. I had a very strong foundation in biology, but I didn't have any experience working in this kind of environment or working abroad even. So I was concerned that this would weaken my application. So I found another opportunity to start working in Asia and get some experience working abroad. And that was actually in Japan. So I moved to Japan for 1 year, and I was on the JET program, which is a government-based program that employs people from abroad to teach English in schools. And I loved it. It was a great experience, but I had a lot of questions from people. Mostly, why are you doing that? Don't you want to be a biologist? What does teaching English have to do with biology? And this is where I can tell you another secret. First of all, understanding different cultures and experiencing how people around the world interact with their environment has absolutely everything to do with biology and conservation. And second of all, I knew what my goal was. And when the time came to apply to this research program that really required a well-rounded student and only had an application success rate of 1 in 5, with my unique academic as well as work experience, I'm happy to say that I made it into the program. So there it is, proof that there is no one right way to become a biologist and achieve your goals. And there I am, undertaking my master's research project in Malaysian Borneo. And best of all, the experience that I had before that point, working with lots of insects, mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and plants, all of that really helped me to create a more well-rounded and balanced research project. But enough about me. That's my whole story. You know it now. Let's move on to the really interesting stuff. Let's talk about lizards. Specifically, let's talk about the Asian water monitor lizards, also known to scientists as Varanus salvator. The Asian water monitor lizard is a species of monitor lizard closely related to one that you might recognize, the giant Komodo dragon. So you can see a picture of a Komodo dragon on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. The water monitor lizards only reach about half the size of its giant cousin, but it's still huge. By comparison, the Komodo dragons reach about 2.5 meters in length, and they can weigh a whopping 70 to 90 kilograms. That's about 1.5 of me. An Asian water monitor lizard, by comparison, usually grows to only about 1.5 meters. That's quite big. It might grow to 2 meters, although the longest recorded monitor lizard was actually over 3 meters long in Sri Lanka. That's a big lizard. They usually weigh about 20 kilograms compared to a Komodo dragon's 70 or 90, but that's still a very heavy animal. One of the common features that all monitor lizards have are these backwards facing teeth, which help them tear and hold on to their prey items. Now, you might have heard that Komodo dragons have really bacteria-filled saliva, and that if they bite you, your wounds might become infected, and that's how they actually hunt down their prey. Maybe you've heard this. Maybe you've also heard that while scientists believe that for a very long time, in 2008, so a few years ago now, we actually discovered the truth is even more interesting, that Komodo dragons, like some snakes, are actually venomous. So they envenomate their prey. And it's not a very powerful venom. It's powerful enough that the wounds don't heal properly. And very often this causes an infection and it causes their prey to die, which makes them easier to hunt down. Now, scientists started to wonder if all monitor lizards have, to some extent, this ability. And the current theory, while we're still checking out the 80 or so monitor lizard species in the world for how venomous they are, is that they probably all contain some kind of venom. So not very nice to be bitten by one of these lizards. So any kind of work that you're doing with them has to be done with an incredible amount of experience and care. Now, the Asian water monitor lizards, they're known as generalist predators, which basically means that they're not that fussy. They'll eat just about anything that's walking or even swimming by them if there's an opportunity to do so. They'll also scavenge, so they'll eat anything that smells remotely like food, including dead animals or, unfortunately, even human garbage. They're also pretty common in Borneo and through a lot of Southeast Asia. So in a way, I kind of like to think of them of Southeast Asia's equivalent to our raccoons. Knowing all of this about them, we figured that they weren't very fussy about where they live either. So they'll just sort of wander around and eat whatever is most convenient. Or so we thought. A few years ago, a PhD candidate based out of Borneo, his name is Sergio Guerrero Sanchez, was the first person to put a monitoring device on some of these lizards. And he started tracking them along this one river, the Kinabatangan, in Malaysian Borneo, and he noticed something really interesting. He noticed that the lizards had what we call a defined home range. So they didn't just wander willy-nilly all over the place. Each of these different colors represents what's called a home range of a different lizard. They seem to like to kind of stick to a particular area. And what's more, within that area that they stuck to, they had one favorite spot that they liked to hang out in the most. So in these diagrams, it's sort of these circular kind of jelly bean shapes. And we call that the core range, with the area outside where the lizards maybe spend much less time known as the transient range. So why were they hanging out in these specific spots? Were they a bit more fussy than we thought? Well, that's where my research came in. So I started sampling these core and these transient ranges to see if I could get an idea what kind of food was found in the core range of each lizard and the transient range. Because my hypothesis, my best guess, was that this selectivity, their reason for being in these areas, had something to do with food. And more specifically, my guess was that in those core ranges, the areas where the lizards spent the most amount of time in, we were going to find a higher diversity of food, more selection in different kinds of things that they could eat. So the different kinds of trapping methodologies I had to use were these. Remember, monitor lizards still love to eat absolutely everything. So I had to use a couple different trapping types to get a really good idea of what they might be eating in an area. The first kind of trap I used was called a pitfall trap. These were great for small prey sampling, things like insects, invertebrates like that forest scorpion, maybe small lizards. Occasionally I even had like a small mammal fall into these traps. I had to go each day, twice a day, to check these traps and see what they had collected and record that. In addition to that, I also looked at the small mammal prey types that these lizards might be eating. So I was also sampling things like tree shrews, that's this unusual looking animal here, squirrels, moon rats, which actually are more like a possum than a rat, and actual jungle rats and mice. And I would trap them in these cage traps. I would take some samples from them in a non-invasive way. We collected some of the ticks and mites from them because those hadn't been studied in that region either. And I collected that data about what kind of small mammal prey was in the core and the transient areas of these lizards as well. I did find one interesting anomaly. There was one lizard who had very, very little land-based prey in her core range. So I thought, what could this lizard be eating? And I looked a bit closer at the map of her core range, and I realized that the majority of it was actually on a lake. And we know that these lizards are really good swimmers, and they're very much capable of eating aquatic animals too. There's actually a very cool paper that was published a few years ago that observed these monitor lizards on the shoreline of Malaysia, going up to tidal pools and taking their big flat tails and slapping fish out of the tide pools and eating them on land. So they're very, very well adapted to their environment and eating whatever they come across. So I decided to try my hand at aquatic sampling. Thankfully, there was some really kind and very patient research assistants who were from the region. They grew up around the Kinabatangan and they grew up as fishermen. So they were able to teach me some of the methods to sample the animals in that lake. One of them was called the boo-boo. And this is what a Malaysian boo-boo looks like. This is a really little one. You can see me with my really big boo-boo there on the picture. And basically how they work is they're this rattan fish trap, and it's got a cone inside. So you can put bait in here in the middle bit. Fish will swim in through this cone. And then when you go to retrieve your trap out of the water, you can remove that cone and you're left with the fish inside the trap. So that was one of the ways that we sampled what kinds of aquatic prey the lizards might be eating. And we got some interesting fish species like that snakehead that's pictured there. I also used a method called a rambat, which was really tricky to master. I had to do a lot of practice, but it's called a cast net method as well. So that helped me sample a little bit more of what was in the larger body of water there. Now, I had some difficulties, as you can imagine, in this environment. I really wanted to do more aquatic sampling, for example, but there was a very good reason why I couldn't do more sampling or try more different kinds of methods. And that reason also had really big teeth. So the Kinabatangan region, that river, and all of the lakes and streams around it are home to saltwater crocodiles, a very healthy population. And they are the largest crocodilians on Earth. They can reach in excess of 5 meters long, and they are everywhere. That is their home. And as researchers, we had to respect that. And everything that we did had to be with the health and safety of us and these animals in mind. What's more is these crocodiles could learn if there's a repeated disturbance on the water. So for them, naturally, that would mean that maybe there was a nest above the water column that was dropping chicks into the water, so it could be a source of food. In my case, the disturbance would be me checking my traps, and I didn't want the crocodiles to learn to hang out where my traps were. You don't want crocodiles to know your schedule. So I had to do all of my sampling at completely random times and completely random places, which scientifically is not necessarily the best method, but it was the best method we could employ in that region. We had some other troubles as well. So obviously this environment is completely different to the prairies in Canada. So I had to learn how to deal with the heat and the humidity and sometimes rain that came down so hard and so fast that it would threaten to sink our boats, which were our only method of transportation. And if that wasn't enough, that year we also had a visit from the pygmy elephants who came to the field center. And I thought I had cleverly hidden my traps from them, but they found, you can see they found my pitfall traps, and they didn't seem to care for them very much in the forest. So I had a little bit of a setback with my research with that too. But nonetheless, I was able to gather enough information from these lizards, and without going into too much detail, because we don't have very much time, but ultimately what I found is that hypothesis that lizards hang out the most in areas where they have the most diversity of food, the most different kinds of things to eat, seemed to be true in the case of the 10 lizards that I studied. So great. But you might be wondering, what's the point of knowing that? What can that affect? Why does it matter why we know where lizards like to hang out? Well, if we step back quickly and have a look at the greater picture, we know that humans need resources to survive. We also know that if we keep taking resources and destroying ecosystems in the way that we have been, we are going to destroy ourselves too. So we have to get smarter about how we collect our resources. Biologists know that not all places on a landscape are created equal. Some places have what are called biodiversity hotspots, which means some places have more plants and animals living on them than others. With this in mind, it would make sense to hang on and protect those spaces with more plants and animals than the ones that have less, right? But how do you find those places that have more species that could be protected? Well, in Malaysian Borneo, for example, where they're expanding oil palm plantations, which are very important for the economy of the countries there, and for the people of Malaysia as well. What you could do if you want to save the parcels of land that have the most animals is potentially follow the animals that will lead you to those areas with the highest species diversity. And that is ultimately what I was proposing with my research, is that if you follow these lizards, they can potentially take you to these areas where if you protect those spots, you may very well likely be contributing to the conservation of the most amount of animals by following the lizards to their prey. All right, and that is my research. That is my journey. Thank you so much for listening. I know it was a bit rapid fire, but I am very happy to take any questions if you have them.
All right, Kasia, thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. And I loved all the colorful visuals and pictures that you put in. And it was so cool to see how your research really took you to a place that was so different and how you had to adapt to that environment. It's really, really inspiring to hear. So
thank you.
Thank you for that. We want to start the Q&A now. So we're going to start with Mrs. Vieira's class in Riverside, California. So I'm just going to add them in, and then they can ask their question if you want to. You're unmuted now.
There we go.
This question was actually from Sal. So Sal, go ahead, ask your question.
Hello.
And you guys say hi. All right, if you're not Sal, please mute yourselves.
Hi.
Sal, go ahead.
You're muted, Miss.
Oh. All right. So I typed Sal's question in the text box.
Do you want to ask the question for them?
Sal, go ahead. Say yours. Sorry.
That's okay.
What is the biggest lizard?
That's a great question. So the biggest lizard on Borneo is actually the Asian water monitor lizard, and the biggest lizard in the world is actually the Komodo dragon. So they're still both species of lizard. A lot of people think that the biggest species of lizard would be a crocodile, but they're not actually lizards anymore. They're crocodilians. So that's a whole nother kettle of fish. So I can proudly say that I was working with the largest species of lizard on Borneo, and they are pretty darn big.
All right, guys, any other questions from you guys? Bella, go ahead.
Have you ever got bitten by one?
Oh, I didn't quite catch that. One more time.
Have you ever gotten bitten by an animal?
Have I ever gotten bitten by an animal? Oh my goodness, more times than I can count. Usually it was most often at the start of my career. I think I've developed faster reflexes now, or you just sort of learn to read animal behavior a lot better. But surprisingly, I think it's very interesting. So when I when I started working with small mammals, when I was catching and trapping all those squirrels and tree shrews, I was nervous about that because the strength of their bites, like I wasn't worried about the lizards because I'd worked with lizards before, but I never handled a squirrel or a big, jungle rat. And you hear stories about how those animals can chew through wire, they can chew through metal, or they chew through wood. So I was nervous about handling these animals, and particularly because I don't like to wear heavy gloves. When I do that, I like to wear really light, just gardening gloves so I can feel the animal and I can feel its heartbeat and I know it's doing okay when I'm handling it, but it leaves me vulnerable to animal bites. I was nervous about that at first, actually. But I have to say that when you're working with these animals, if you're experienced and you've been doing it for a while and you're calm and you kind of express, I guess, I don't know, that sense of mutual respect, the animals really, I don't know if they can feel it, but I think they were always very calm, and I didn't actually get a single small mammal bite the entire time I was in Borneo. They kind of, once I was handling them and I had them in the correct grip, they were all very calm and just sort of let me do the work that I needed to do. So I guess that's the moral here. You can expect animal bites if you don't really know what you're doing, or if you're being very erratic, or if you're afraid, they'll probably end up being afraid. But if you ease into it and you learn from the best, I had great teachers, you probably won't experience as many animal bites as you think.
All right, that was a great question. So now we're going to move on to Mr. Dunn's class from Sudbury, Ontario. So we're going to add him in.
Hi there.
Hi, Kasia. That was a great presentation. Thank you for sharing your experiences.
Thank you so much.
I have Sophia from our class has a question, so I'm going to try and put her on. Go ahead, Sophia. If you want to unclick your microphone, you can ask your question. Sophia, can you hear me?
Yep. Have you ever been in a situation where it was dangerous?
Oh, sorry, one more time.
Have you ever been in a situation where you felt in danger that was dangerous?
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, in my field of work, there can be a high degree of risk. And I'm very fortunate, and everyone I think I've worked with was quite fortunate because we had really great teachers, we had very good communication, and we learned how to handle those situations in the way that was the most safe. I'll tell you a very quick story as an example. So when I would set up my traps in Borneo, for example, I would set them up in something called a trap line, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was just a straight line of traps, maybe every, I think it was 15 meters, I had a trap set up along the line. And over the trapping period of one of the areas where I had my trap, the water level started to rise from the river, which happens. You can imagine with the amount of rain that you get out in Borneo, sometimes the rivers flood. And when the water level goes up, the crocodiles start roaming out further and further onto the riverbank and into the forest. And there was one moment where, I was under pressure. I needed to get my data. I was doing my research, but we were walking along my trap line. We were seeing the water every day, kind of higher and higher. And one day we walked through and there was very clearly the track of a big croc that had crossed the trap line. So they were around, the big crocs were hanging around. And I had to make a decision whether, I should take down that trap line for a while to disrupt my research for the safety of the people I was working with, or whether I should keep going. And of course, we took the trap line down because you just don't want to take chances with the wildlife out there. You want to keep everyone safe. So these were normal, not every day, but normal occurrences that we had to keep in mind. So yeah, you can have times like that where you feel a little bit a little bit surprised by the element of danger.
All right, thank you. Now we're going to go to YouTube for a question from the live stream. So someone said, I noticed the lizards have different colors. Is that environmental, defensive, or camouflage perhaps?
Oh, what a great question. So actually, I'll try to keep a succinct answer to this, but monitor lizards are one of the groups of lizards where we're finding now with genetic work and work with DNA that there's way more species than we originally thought. And originally, even the group Varanus salvator, we thought that all of these lizards, in Borneo and then further south in Indonesia and further north in the Philippines, we thought everything that kind of looked like a monitor lizard was that one species. But now we are actually finding more and more diversity. We're finding that there's more species than we originally thought, and they have these subtle differences. So with most of Varanus salvator, the color is sort of camouflage, even though they don't really, once they're older, they don't have a lot of naturally occurring predators. It'd probably be mostly to hide them from their prey. But the colors can also indicate that they're different subspecies and different species that maybe we haven't really investigated yet. There's one big debate at the moment, which maybe now it's been resolved. I haven't checked in the last year or so, where there was one type of Varanus salvator, the same species, which was pitch black. It was really, really deep black. And people were starting to say, you know what, it's the same size, it has the same shape as the monitor lizards in Borneo, for example, but it's just suspicious that it's got this really unique black pigment. And they started looking at the DNA and they started making a case to argue that this was actually at least a different subspecies, if not a different species altogether. So to answer your question, we hardly know. We barely even know what's out there, let alone knowing for sure why these variations in color exist. We can only make guesses about that at this point.
All right, and that's why Kasia is doing such amazing research to figure out a little bit more about these species. So we're going to go back to the live stream, and we're going to get a question from Mr. Aiken's class in London, Ontario. So I'm going to add them in. And if they want to unmute the mic to ask a question.
Yeah, we had a question from Tara, and she wanted to know, do the monitor lizards harm people who live around the area? And then we also had the question, do the monitor lizards compete with the crocodiles for food?
Great, those are both great questions. The first question, do they harm people? It's very, very unlikely. So you saw their teeth. They can. In self-defense, if you catch a monitor lizard and you don't know how to handle it, you don't know how to work with it, monitor lizards will defend themselves and they can hurt humans, absolutely. Do they go out of their way to hunt people or harm people? Absolutely not. In fact, in that presentation that I just gave, you may have noticed that a few of the images I had of monitor lizards were from the internet. There was only one image that I didn't credit because it was my own. And that's because they're so hard to photograph, because as soon as they see you, even from a long distance, they just want to run away. They just want to get away. They're not really interested in harming people. They just kind of want to do their own thing. And actually, that makes it a bit sad, because the reality is that they are the most hunted reptile in the world. They've now outranked crocodiles for being hunted for their skin. So a lot of lizard skin products, or even sometimes things that are sold as crocodile skin products, are actually monitor lizard skin products. So they're being hunted by the hundreds of thousands, if not more. So we are way more harmful to them than they are to us. The second question, the second question about do monitor lizards compete with crocodiles for food is a really interesting one. They sort of can. So we had some interesting moments on the river where we'd come across, for example, a dead bearded pig. which they like to kind of, they're like wild boars of Borneo, and they roam the riverside. And occasionally we'd find one that was washed up that, you know, had died for whatever reason. And the monitor lizards would be trying to get in there and get their fill of that animal before the crocodiles came and stole it away. The crocodiles are still obviously much bigger and much heavier than the monitor lizards. So depending on the size of each one, the monitor lizards have to be careful not to become a snack for the crocodiles. It can work the other way around though. We have had recorded incidents of big monitor lizards chomping on baby crocodiles in the Kinabatangan too. So a lot of different kinds of interaction. Both species will kind of eat whatever comes across their way. The big thing is, though, monitor lizards like to hang out on land mostly, and the crocodiles, of course, mostly hang out in the water.
Okay, that was super cool. So now we're going to bring in Miss Callum's class from Winnipeg. Do you have any questions from the students that they want to ask Kasia about?
Oh, hi, Kasia. Great presentation. So happy to see somebody from the prairies.
Right on. Yeah, that's great.
My students say you got some serious grit, girl. So hooray.
Thank you.
One question from Kira. She's asking, what languages are spoken on the island of Borneo?
Wow. Oh, what a great question. That's probably a whole other conversation I could have, but the quick answer is there are loads. The official language that's mostly spoken around the Malaysian part of Borneo is Malay, but the kind of dialects of Malay really vary regionally. And I didn't speak a lot of Malay. I tried my best to communicate with as much Malay as I could learn during my time there. But I found it really interesting how the staff that were local from there, each one of them could tell exactly where the other one was from, even along kind of the river area, because each region had a distinct sort of dialect or accent in Malay that they spoke. And it's very different even between peninsular Malaysia, where you have Kuala Lumpur, and the island of Borneo. Borneo also has a history of a lot of indigenous tribes that each would have had their own languages as well. So there's a lot of river tribes, the Dayak tribes, for example. And unfortunately, I think quite a few of their languages over time have even been lost. So it's an extremely culturally diverse area, and just like how people like myself are trying their best to contribute to the conservation of the animals and plants of that region, there's a whole nother set of people who are doing their best to conserve the culture of that island as well, which is really, really diverse. I'm sorry I can't give you a number off the top of my head of how many languages are spoken. Just Malaysia itself, actually, it's also worth noting, I think has at least 3 official languages. So yeah, it's a very, very culturally diverse place.
Awesome. And now we're going to go to Joe. If you want to ask a question, would you like to ask a question, Joe? Okay.
What's your favorite kind of lizard that you've studied?
Oh, Joe, that's such a tricky question, and you know that it is. How can anyone choose a favorite lizard? Oh my goodness. Let me see. Actually, so after I finished my research in Borneo, my job for the last few years, I was actually working at a really amazing museum in England called Manchester Museum. And my job there was, I was an assistant curator for a live animal collection. And we had a monitor lizard in our collection, but it wasn't like the ones I was used to. So monitor lizards, some of them are aquatic, like this Asian water monitor lizard I've been telling you about, but there's also smaller species that live entirely in trees. They're arboreal. And we had one of these species of arboreal monitor lizards that was bright green, and its tail was prehensile, so it could wrap around branches and help it climb. And I just thought it was so interesting, this really close relative of something I had studied for so long that was so similar in so many ways, but also completely different. So if you're twisting my arm and I have to choose a favorite at the moment, that's the one that I'm going to pick. But you must know that it changes every day. Basically, any lizard I see on a given day, that's my favorite one.
And there's so many lizards to choose from, so how can we even pick one?
Exactly.
All right. So to end off, we're going to do one more question from YouTube. And this kind of summarizes everything nicely. So a lot of the students are saying that they're really interested in biology and that they want to potentially pursue this, which is awesome in the future. So how did you in particular become interested, and what inspired you to pursue this particular research?
That's a great question. And for the answer to this question, I think I am going to look for inspiration to my old master's supervisor, who I mentioned in this presentation, Professor Benoit Goossens. So very, very briefly, when I first met Professor Benoit Goossens, after reading all of his research and being so excited to meet this person, still a mentor of mine to this day, his big passion in his career was elephants. And my first question when I met him was, why elephants? Like, why study elephants of all the animals? Why are you the elephant man? And he just looked at me and he said, why anything? Why love anything? Why does that ever happen? And I actually really like that answer, because I think, especially in science, you get so used to having to provide evidence for everything. Good scientists will do that, and to think critically about data that you have, that's important. But I think it's also important not to set aside that part of your humanity, that part of what makes you a person, that just allows you to love things, and maybe love them for no reason at all, other than you just do, you're just capable of that. And I've decided that after years of thinking, why was I so interested in Borneo? Why do I still remain so interested in that part of the world today? What drove me to all of that? Never having a concrete answer, I think I've come to the point where I can say that just, why not? I loved it. It just became something that I really loved, and I still love it. And I hope that all of you find that something that drives you to that passion and to that love as well. And I hope that you can follow it just like I've been lucky enough to do too.
And what a perfect way to end off the presentation for today. You segued so nicely. So we all wanted to say thank you for sharing your research, Kasia, and I think you're making an impact on a lot of students watching. So thank you for your
Wonderful.
time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone tuning in from all over the place. It was such a pleasure to speak to all of you today.
All right. So thanks everyone for watching, and tune in for some more broadcasts following on the Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants website.